Welcome to Litcast, the podcast covering literature notes and revision for GCSE. These podcasts are designed to be used as an additional revision tool. There's nothing new or groundbreaking here, just revision notes in an on-the-go friendly format. Using these alone won't guarantee you an A star, but they can help you build your confidence to apply this knowledge to your exam questions and your classwork. With that being said, let's get started. Hello everyone, in this episode we are going to be talking about some of the minor characters in Heroes and the connections between them and some of the major themes within the story. There are several minor characters in the story, but for the purposes of revision we're just going to focus on 4 of them. We're going to focus on Arthur, Mrs. Bellander, Joey and Enrico. Arthur Riviere is another ex-serviceman and a local boy. And he was once the star baseball player for the Frenchtown Tigers, and Francis is a friend of his and remembers him with admiration for his sporting prowess. When he first appears in his uniform, Francis actually wants to emulate him, and he's another example of someone that Francis looks up to and is another of Francis's sort of heroes. Arthur recognises Francis, linking to appearance and reality. He recognises Francis in the club, but he agrees to keep the secret. Arthur's character is used in the novel as a representation of all the soldiers who've suffered. So one of the key chapters is one where Arthur is found drunk and stumbling, and the facade has slipped, and the true impact of war is kind of apparent. And one of the quotes that he that is associated very much with him is, "No heroes in that scrapbook, Francis, only us, the boys of Frenchtown." So that idea of them not being heroes, just being normal people who were doing what they had to do. And in that really key chapter for Arthur, which is chapter 8, he kind of finishes his heartfelt tale by saying, "We weren't heroes, we were only there." And that again is a key quote in terms of linking to heroism as well. That idea that heroes aren't born heroes. The concept of heroism isn't someone who was always destined to do that. It's that idea that you're in a certain situation and you just have to do the best you can, and then other people may perceive you as a hero when actually you yourself just are dealing with something that's far more horrific than perhaps you feel a hero has to deal with, and certainly you don't feel that you embody that perception of a hero that everyone talks about. He appears to be positive about the future, but like Francis, he hides the truth behind a mask. So Arthur actually deals with the trauma of war by meeting up and socialising with other veterans, whereas Francis prefers to be alone. And again, it shows the disparity in the way that people cope with trauma and the way that trauma manifests itself, and the kind of both the physical and the emotional toll that it takes. There's a moving portrait of a drunk Arthur in that chapter 8, and that's where we really get to find out what's going on in his head. And it's a key kind of chapter to look at in terms of understanding in general, in beyond the text, in the wider world, the fact that lots of people deal with trauma, and they may have a facade put up, so they may be able to laugh and joke and be in a group and socialise normally, but actually there's something going on beneath the surface. And it really draws attention to that in quite a poignant way. Arthur draws attention then to the cruelty of war because it turns young boys into killers. And there's the quote that Francis uses when he talks about war, boys with apple cheeks. And that idea that everyone who's fighting that war is young and has their whole life ahead of them, and yet they're fighting and ending, other boys' lives who again have their lives ahead of them, and it's an utterly tragic situation. So then our next character is Mrs. Bellander. She is Francis's lady in Frenchtown, and she represents the attitude of townspeople towards the war veterans. If you're going to remember one thing that Mrs. Belander says, then you remember poor boy. She regards the veterans with pity, and she calls Francis a boy, so he's still not an adult in her eyes, despite all of the horrors that he's been through. She is kind and she is caring. Her home is a refuge for Francis, and it's the only place where he really appears to be at ease in the story. She's also a part of Francis's past, although she doesn't necessarily recognise that. Because she doesn't recognise him physically. He used to do her errands, and she baked him a birthday cake when he was 13. The character of Mrs. Belander is also used as a structural device by Cormier, as she is the person who lets Francis know that Larry LaSalle has returned to Frenchtown. So it's important because she's a plot device. We wouldn't have reached that closure without her kind of being there. So the connection between these two characters is pretty key. Although they are contrasting, Arthur and Mrs. Belander represent the good nature of the people of Frenchtown. They both respond to Francis with understanding and offer their support to him with sympathy and respect. And when you're looking at the minor characters, because it is possible that minor characters can come up as an essay question, then again, think about that triangle that I mentioned a couple of episodes back. That idea that, you've got characters, key moments and relationships and themes, each on the side of a triangle. So you cover up characters. So you need to be thinking about key moments for characters, key relationships and key themes. So for Arthur Riviere, that chapter 8 is clearly a key moment for him. And what does that show about him? Well, it really shows that idea of the horrors of war and the trauma that's been experienced as a result of the horrors that he has been through. It shows the different ways that people cope with the war and its aftermath. And Mrs. Belander is the other side of that. So she shows the layperson, the kind of the townspeople, their sympathy towards the veterans, rather than admiration and hailing them as heroes and cheering them on. They regard them with sympathy because they're now aware of what the horrors of the war are like. So those two characters can both be potentially used to bounce off each other in a way. The next two characters are Joey LeBlanc and Enrico Ruccelli. And I suppose, well, again, these work quite well as a pair. So Joey LeBlanc is a friend of Francis, and they sometimes went to the cinema together. He would get in trouble. He talks out of turn. Joey is a really important character because he's quite astute. So he picks up on things to do with Larry that Francis doesn't necessarily pick up on, but we as the reader have picked up on. So Joey's almost working with us a little bit. And an example of that is, better watch out, Mr. LaSalle, Francis has got your number. So starting to work out that there's a little bit of tension between them perhaps, or a little bit of competition. Joey's a confident boy. He's the complete opposite to Francis. He lives in Francis's memory, so we see him in the almost flashbacks as a pre-war boy. He died in the war. So we can't see the effect that it had on his character. But what it does show is that Joey, out of all of the friends that Francis has, is the most charismatic, he's the most outgoing, he's got the most going for him. And it shows that war isn't necessarily selective in who it affects and how it affects them. If you were to write a film and have these characters in them, then it's likely Joey would be the one that survived because he's that charismatic hero. And yet he doesn't. He dies because war doesn't discriminate. War doesn't get to pick who lives and who dies. And Joey, unfortunately, didn't make it. So that unrelenting nature of war as well is shown. His comments about the rec centre and Larry create a sense of apprehension, and he suggests that Larry might not be what he seems. He cottons on to Larry before other people, perhaps. His death at Ioma shows the indiscriminate nature of war. So that idea again that you can be as charismatic and talented as you like, but war doesn't register that and give you an extra chance or anything like that. Then you've got Enrico Ruccelli. He was a close wartime comrade of Francis. He shows great courage and is used to illustrate some of the horrors of war as well. He suffered severe physical injuries. He lost both his legs and his left arm. Although they're very different personalities, Francis and Enrico are united by their terrible injuries and their suffering. He displays a certainty about his future plans, which Francis doesn't. He's very, very clear about what he wants to do. Francis is ambiguous, and that is a trend with Francis right up until the final pages. We don't really know what happens to Francis after the end of the story, but we know what happened with Enrico. He was very, very clear that he did not see his life as worth living, and he actually describes himself and his body as not being kind of worth anything. Although he doesn't appear in the main action of the novel, his comments, as reported by Francis, are very significant because he's the first to inform the readers that Francis was actually awarded the Silver Star for heroism. Francis is obviously ashamed of this, but it's important that we understand that because that means that even if we were looking at this from a purely factual basis, Francis is a hero. Despite the fact he has severe injuries, he still teases Francis, and although he's outwardly cheerful, his sense of despair adds to that overall atmosphere of the book and demonstrates again the impact of war on these characters. He regards himself not as a person, but as something which should be disposed of. So that idea that, that was his idea, that he wanted to end his life and he wanted to be disposed of. A key quote for him, sometimes I think he talked so much to cover up the pain. So again, if the minor characters comes up, I think people get quite scared about the minor characters as an essay question, but there's so much to talk about because of all the themes that they can link to and represent and exemplify. The main one really being the horrors of war. If you look at Arthur Riviere, you could link him in too. Arthur, has got a lot of emotional issues and mental issues as a result of the war and the trauma that he experienced, and he deals with that through keeping company and drinking. Joey LeBlanc paid the ultimate price, and that in itself shows the horrors of war. His absence in the later parts chronologically of the book show the horrors of war, and Enrico Ruccelli, of course, there's the physical side of that. So in terms of Joey and Enrico, the connection between them is the awful effects of war on ordinary young men. They entered the war out of a sense of duty, as most men did back then, but it destroyed them. They are victims, and their potential is destroyed forever, obviously in very different ways. For Francis, the dead and the maimed always exist within his mind, and by including characters like this that have all been affected in different ways by the war, it serves to exemplify how Francis has also been affected. Other characters that you could talk about or mention in the story include Dr. Abrams, Marie, Sister Mathilde, Sister Gertrude, Uncle Louis, Louis Arabelle, Mr. Laurier. Then you've got loads of the other wartime comrades of Francis, Norman, Eddie, Irwin, Jack, Sonny, Blinky, Spooks, Billy, Henry, and kind of, you wouldn't necessarily have to mention any of them by name, but understanding who they are as a group, like those being wartime comrades of Francis. And then you've got Armand, Joe, George, and the Strangler, who are all regulars at the St. Jude Club as well. So there are quite a few characters in such a small text, really. And of course, you've got the three main characters, which are going to be a main focus and are going to be key in whatever essays you write. But actually, understanding some of these minor characters and their function, again, is just worth being aware of them, really. And remember that when we're talking about this story, we're talking about Cormier and all of his constructs, and the characters as constructs, as figments of his imagination that he's put on the page. So when we are writing our essay responses, we really want to make sure that we're including Cormier as the focus and his purpose and his craft, what his intentions are, what he wants to exemplify, what words he chooses, because he speaks through the voice of Francis, but he is the one that has constructed this story. So that's the end of this episode on the minor characters in Heroes. I promise we will get onto themes in the next episode, but I thought it was important to maybe include an episode on minor characters because they can come up, and they are, despite being minor in terms of the amount they appear in the text, they are really important in terms of embodying some of these themes and generally adding some richness to the text as well. Thank you very much for listening. As always, if there is anything that you want to go through in more detail, if you have any questions or any comments, then you can either tweet using the links in the description, or you can leave a voice comment on the podcast page itself. And if you leave a question, then there's a chance that you can then be featured in an episode where we can discuss it and answer it. As always, none of this information is new or groundbreaking. Your class teachers have more information and loads of really good valuable resources for this text. And a lot of the information that I get, amongst other sources, is from the York Notes Revision Guide, which I'm sure your class teachers have for you to view, or of course they are available to purchase as well. Thank you very much for listening, and hope to see you in the next. So that's it for this episode on Larry LaSalle, the last of the three major characters in the book Heroes by Robert Cormier. If there's anything in particular that you want covered in these Litcast episodes, then feel free to tweet, or you can leave a voice message response on this podcast, which you can listen to on a whole variety of platforms now. I think we're on about 6 platforms now. If there's anything, as I said, in particular that you would like us to cover, then just let us know via Twitter or via those voice messages. And remember that everything that I'm going through is not groundbreaking, it's not new. Your class teachers have resources that cover this in much more detail. But one of the key sources that I use, and a lot of class teachers use, is the York Notes. Your class teachers may have a copy that you can have a look at, or they are, of course, available to purchase as well. Thank you very much for listening to this episode, and we'll be beginning the themes and covering some of the major themes in Heroes in our next episode. Thanks very much for listening, and we'll hopefully see you in the next one. The music used in this podcast is by Ixon, and you can find him on SoundCloud. The tracks used are Eclipse and Explore.